Hello, this is my response and reflection for our October 7th lection on supporting LGBTQIA2S plus students. I'd like to respond to the concept of teaching with the ethic of hospitality, or creating a classroom environment where all students feel safe to be themselves and have flexibility to showcase their expression of gender. I thought that was such an important concept, especially in relation to Cornell's article as well about supporting 2S LGBTQIA students, as well as Ayrton et al.'s article about gender expression. Made me think about universal design and how they say both in Cornell's article, both trans and abortion rights ultimately come down to the same principle: autonomy over one's body. So when you support one issue and you support a group of people in living their best lives, LGBTQIA students, you're also supporting women and everybody with uterus seeking abortion care and rights, because you are creating an ethic of personal accountability and autonomy. And say, yeah, I thought it was great. And yeah, I thought there were really interesting points in the readings about how one of them that Cornell cited was how youth in grades 8 through 12 in a national study found that 79% of trans students who had been victims of physical harassment reported that teachers and staff were ineffective in addressing transphobic harassment. And as teachers, so we talked about in our class about tools and strategies that we could use as teachers to be not avoiders or hesitators, but confronters and ultimately integrators, hopefully, reacting to homophobia and transphobia in our placements and later on in the workplace, by and supporting students. So some tools that we talked about were personal reflection and preparation, practicing intervention role play, which is what we did in class, which was super helpful, in our case study of Bathe the Cat, and talking about how we would react if a parent did email us with concerns about LGBTQIA content in the classroom, and how we could actually approach a situation like that, and the ways that we are protected by the Ontario's Human Rights Code, so that we can continue to advocate for queer and trans students instead of feeling helpless and also like we can't do anything and shouldn't because we need to keep our jobs. And instead, making sure that we are always advocating for our most vulnerable students. So more strategies they talked about were intervention. So if we witness harassment and bullying, especially anti-LGBTQI bullying, directly addressing it and talking to the class about what's happening and why it's wrong, instead of either dismissing it or treating it also like just a blanket term bullying. It's specific, and we need to name it and talk about it, and talk about why it's wrong, because if we don't model that, students will not know, and it really is up to us, especially since they might have, very different experiences at home. And, just like how parents who want to maybe opt their children out of classes in school where we're directly addressing queerness and like sexual health. It's not so simple because it's not something that is always in the lesson plan, but is brought up organically and situationally, such as in addressing comments that a student might make to another one, or even about something like reading something like bathe the cat, and if a student says like, that's wrong, I don't understand this kind of family, instead of overlooking something like that or dismissing something like that, intervening early on and saying, okay, let's talk about this. Let's talk about why you think that, but also this, why we have this story and why there are families like that. And it's, important to normalize queer and families, and also all kinds of gender expression in the classroom, and how important it is to integrate queer people in the classroom through books and literature, not just statistics, and also not just sad stories, but also celebrating queer and trans political figures and athletes and writers, actors, etc. So I thought, it was great to talk about teaching with the ethic of hospitality and creating a classroom environment where all students feel safe to be themselves and have flexibility to showcase their expression of gender. I thought that connected the Ayrton et al. Readings about gender expression and how everybody benefits from talking about gender expression, having that protected in schools. I thought that was really important. And they talked about how 1 in 4 non-LGBTQ students report being verbally harassed about their gender expression, and 10% being physically harassed or assaulted for the same. So not even just LGBTQ students, but a lot of, like 25% of all students are harassed for gender expression. This is something I've talked a lot about with my boyfriend, who is a cis man, but he was bullied relentlessly growing up and called the F word constantly, just because he dressed. He grew up in a very small town and dressed artistically, and even though he is very protected in many ways, and he doesn't, harbor a lot of the pain that he might if he was not in a very privileged position, it still was very painful for him growing up. So if there had been a teacher or any adult who intervened in situations like that, witnessing gender-based harassment or gender expression harassment and bullying specifically, and they had intervened, maybe other students who were not cis men would also feel more comfortable expressing themselves, instead of teachers, as we talked about in class, just saying like, well, I don't have any students who are trans, I don't have any students who are queer, so I don't need to implement this kind of curriculum or these policies in the school. Instead, you're preventing students from expressing themselves fully by not providing these policies and upholding them, let alone examples of queerness in schools, because students are not going to feel comfortable expressing themselves. So gender-based gender expression protections in schools help everybody. And it was great to talk about and practice how we can actually implement these things in our classrooms, even if they're not part of our school's policies, and that we are protected through Ontario's Human Rights Act so that we can protect our students. I hope that this makes sense. Thank you for listening.